My grandmother fell in love twice in her life. The first time was with my grandfather Floyd at a barn dance in Cabot, Vermont in 1941. She was 19, he was 22 and had sawdust in his hair from the lumber mill where he worked 6 days a week. She told me once that he smelled like fresh-cut spruce and tobacco, and that the combination made her knees go soft, and that she knew by the second song that she was going to marry him. They were married 11 months later, 2 weeks before he shipped out for North Africa. He came home in '45 with a piece of German shrapnel in his hip and a tremor in his left hand that never quite went away. And they spent the next 31 years building a life on 120 acres of hill farm in Woodbury, Vermont. Why, that had been in the Thibodeau family since 1896. They raised 3 children. They sugared 4,000 taps every March. They buried 2 dogs and a barn cat named General Patton. And on the morning of November 9th, 1976, my grandfather walked out to the sugar house to check a leaking roof, sat down on the stacking bench, and died of a heart attack at the age of 57. My grandmother found him an hour later, sitting upright with his hands on his knees and his eyes open, looking out the doorway at the mountain he'd spent his whole life staring at. The second time my grandmother fell in love, she was blind. She was 55 years old, a widow of 14 months. And the thing she fell in love with stood over 7 feet tall and came down from the Green Mountains on a January night, so cold the sap froze in the maples, and the stones in the wall along the north pasture cracked from the temperature. My grandmother could not see it. She heard it first, then smelled it, then touched it, and she loved it for the next 28 years, until the morning she died in the farmhouse bedroom where she'd been born, with her hand extended toward the window and the snow falling outside and something large and dark standing at the tree line 200 yards away that every single member of my family saw, but none of us have ever spoken about to anyone outside of blood. My name is Hazel Thibodeau. I am 46 years old. I run the sugarbush that my grandparents built. And I am telling this story now because my grandmother asked me to, and because she was right that the time has come, and because there are things in the mountains of central Vermont that have been here longer than the farms, longer than the towns, longer than the stone walls and the church steeples and the covered bridges, and someone needs to say it out loud before everyone who knows is gone. I need to start with the farm because the farm is the reason for everything. The Thibodeau place sits at the end of a gravel road that the town stopped maintaining in 1968, about 4 miles outside the village of Woodbury. The house is a cape, white clapboard, built in 1896 by my great-great-grandfather Émile Thibodeau, who came down from Quebec with $60 and a team of Belgian draft horses and bought the land from a dairy farmer who was moving to Burlington. Behind the house is the sugar house, a post and beam building with a cupola vent that my grandfather rebuilt in '59. Beyond the sugar house, the land rises steeply into mixed hardwood forest, sugar maple and yellow birch, and American beech, climbing up the west face of a ridge that the family has always called Thibodeau Mountain, though it does not appear on any official map under that name. The ridge runs roughly north-south for about 3 miles and tops out at just under 2,800 feet. It is steep, heavily wooded, and essentially roadless. The nearest house in that direction is over 6 miles away on the other side of the mountain, in the town of Calais. Our farm sits in a shallow valley at the base of a mountain that has no roads, no trails that the state maintains, no cell coverage, no power lines, and no reason for anyone to climb it except to tap trees in March or hunt deer in November. What lives on that mountain has lived there without interruption for as long as anyone in my family can remember, and what my grandmother did after Floyd died was not a lapse in judgment or the symptom of a grief-stricken mind. It was, as she told me many times, the most honest thing she ever did. My grandmother was born Alma in 1922 in a farmhouse about 2 miles south of ours, the youngest of 7 children in a family that spoke French at home and English at school, and lived as most French-Canadian families in central Vermont lived at that time, which is to say they worked until they couldn't stand up, and then they sat down and worked some more. Her father logged and farmed. Her mother ran the household like a supply sergeant. Alma learned to cook on a wood stove, to sew her own clothes, to tap a maple tree by the time she was 8, and to keep her mouth shut about things that didn't concern other people, which was a skill that would become the most important one she ever possessed. She married Floyd Thibodeau in February of 42, and by March he was gone to the war. She moved into the Thibodeau farmhouse with Floyd's mother, Cecile, and spent the next 3 years running the farm with 2 aging in-laws and whatever help she could borrow from neighboring families who were themselves short-handed because their men were overseas too. She sugared alone that first spring, hauling sap in buckets through knee-deep snow to the evaporator that Floyd's father had built from salvaged sheet metal. She did this at 5'3" and 115 pounds, carrying 40-pound buckets up slopes that would make a mule think twice. She told me once that the war didn't scare her because the worst thing that could happen was Floyd not coming home, and she had already decided she could survive that if she had to. What scared her was a bad sugar season, because that meant no money, and no money meant losing the farm, and losing the farm meant losing the only thing that connected her to a man she wasn't sure she'd ever see again. Floyd came home. They took over the farm when his parents passed, and they built it into something solid. Nobody was getting rich, but the bills got paid and the roof didn't leak. So they expanded the sugarbush from 1,500 taps to 4,000. They ran 30 head of dairy cattle until the milk price dropped in the 60s, and they sold the herd and switched to beef. They had 3 children, my uncle Gerard in 46, my father Gerald in 49, and my aunt Colette in 53. The children grew up working the farm as all farm children did, which meant they were useful before they were old enough for school and indispensable by the time they were 10. My father, Gerald, was the one who stayed. Gerard went to work for the State Highway Department in Montpelier, and Colette married a man from Morrisville and moved to his family's dairy operation. Gerald married my mother, June Prue, in 1974, and they built a small house on the property about 300 yards east of the main farmhouse, close enough to help with chores and far enough for privacy. I was born in that house in 1978. My brother Leon was born in 80. All of that is the ordinary history of an ordinary Vermont hill farm. And I am telling you all of it because what happened on that farm starting in the winter of 1978 was so far from ordinary that without the foundation of normalcy, you might mistake my family for lunatics. We are not lunatics. We are Thibodeaus, and Thibodeaus have been farming this valley for 130 years, and everything I am about to tell you is the truth. Floyd died in November of 76. The heart attack was massive and instant. The doctor in Woodbury, a man named Francis Doyle, said Floyd probably didn't feel anything. Alma accepted this information with the same stoic composure she applied to everything, which is to say she didn't cry in front of the doctor or the funeral director or the neighbors who brought casseroles or the minister who performed the service at the United Church of Woodbury. She cried once alone on the stacking bench in the sugar house where Floyd had died, and my father found her there the next morning with her coat buttoned wrong and her hands raw from the cold, and he brought her back to the house and made her tea and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Her vision had been failing for years before Floyd died. She'd been diagnosed with macular degeneration in 1970 at the age of 48. And by 74, she was using a magnifying glass to read the newspaper. By the time Floyd died, she could make out shapes and light, but couldn't read, couldn't drive, couldn't identify a face from across a room. By the spring of '78, she was functionally blind. The ophthalmologist in Montpellier, a man named Dr. Bernard Gagnon, told my father that there was no treatment. The disease would continue to progress. She might retain some light perception indefinitely, or she might lose everything. There was no way to predict. She handled this as she handled everything. She memorized the farmhouse. She counted steps. She organized her kitchen so that every jar, every utensil, every pot had a specific location and never moved from it. She developed a system for matching her clothes by sewing small buttons of different shapes into the collars, circles for blue, squares for green, triangles for red. She moved across the property by touch and memory, following the stone wall along the pasture with her right hand, counting fence posts to know how far she'd gone, using the slope of the ground and the direction of the wind to orient herself. She refused to move in with my parents. She refused to go to a home. She said the farmhouse was her house, and she would die in it, and that was the end of that conversation every time it started. Alma was not helpless. My grandmother was a woman who had run a farm in wartime, alone at 20 years old. Blindness slowed her down. It didn't stop her. She cooked every meal. She kept the house cleaner than most sighted people kept theirs. She walked to the sugar house every morning and ran her hands over the evaporator pans, and could tell by the residue whether the last boil had been too hot or not hot enough. She had a radio in the kitchen that she listened to all day, and she could identify every bird in the valley by its call, and she knew when rain was coming by the way the air tasted, and she knew when it was below zero by the way the house settled and popped at night. What she could not do was be alone. And after Floyd died, alone was what she was. Not in the sense that my parents were 300 yards away and Gerard was in Montpellier and Colette was in Morrisville. In the sense that the person who had been the center of her life for 34 years was gone, and the house was quiet with a silence that no radio could fix, and the nights were long. And she was a 56-year-old blind woman lying in a bed that was too big and listening to a silence that had once been filled with Floyd's breathing and his weight shifting on the mattress and the small involuntary sounds a person makes in sleep that you don't notice until they stop. The first winter after Floyd died was brutal. January of '77 was the coldest in recorded history for central Vermont. The temperatures stayed below zero for 22 consecutive days. The pipes in the farmhouse froze twice despite my father wrapping them in heat tape. The wood stove in the kitchen ran around the clock, and my grandmother kept a fire in the parlor stove too, and still the frost crept up the inside of the window panes and stayed there until March. She was burning through cordwood faster than my father could split it. He was out there every Saturday with the maul and the wedge, stacking 4-foot rows against the woodshed wall, and it was barely enough. It was during that January, during the deepest cold, that my grandmother heard something outside for the first time. She told me about this when I was 15, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while my parents were at a church supper. She said she'd been lying in bed on a night when the thermometer on the porch read 26 below zero, too cold to sleep, listening to the house creak and the wind push against the north wall, and she heard footsteps. They weren't my father's footsteps, and they weren't any animal she recognized. Heavy footsteps, purposeful and evenly spaced, crossing the dooryard from the direction of the tree line. They stopped near the woodshed. She heard a sound she couldn't identify, a low grinding noise like stone being dragged across stone. Then the footsteps went back toward the trees. Then nothing. In the morning, she put on her coat and boots and felt her way to the woodshed. The door was open, which was unusual because my father always latched it. She reached inside to the nearest row of cordwood and found a difference. The wood that had been there the night before was split but rough. My father's work chunky and uneven because he was a farmer, not a lumberjack. What she touched now was different. Larger pieces split with a precision she could feel in the grain. The surfaces smooth where a force had separated the fibers along their natural lines rather than forcing them apart with a wedge. And there was more of it. The row that had been 4 feet long the night before was now 8 feet long. Someone or something had added a full cord of wood to the shed overnight, in 26 below zero weather, without waking her or leaving tracks that my father could see in the packed snow the next day. My father couldn't see tracks because it hadn't snowed, and whatever had come down from the mountain had walked on the frozen crust of the existing snow without breaking through it. My father weighed 180 pounds and couldn't walk 10 feet on that crust without falling through to his hips. She told my father about the wood. He examined it. He said it wasn't cut with an axe or a saw. The pieces were torn apart. The grain was shattered at the split points, not sheared. Whatever had done this had pulled logs apart with its hands the way you'd tear a phone book. My father, who was a practical man with no time for speculation, said someone was probably messing around, maybe a neighbor playing a prank, and he latched the woodshed door with a padlock that night. In the morning, the padlock was still in place. So was the woodshed door. But stacked against the outside of the woodshed wall, neatly arranged in 2 rows, was another half cord of wood, torn, not cut, delivered without a sound. This happened 4 more times that January. Each time the wood appeared overnight, stacked with a care that suggested intention, not randomness. Each time my grandmother heard the footsteps. Each time my father found no tracks, no evidence, a nothing except cordwood that shouldn't have been there and hadn't been there the night before. In early February, my grandmother found something on her doorstep. She nearly tripped on it coming out the door to get to the privy. It was a rabbit, freshly killed, still warm. Its neck was broken cleanly. There was no blood, no wound, except the break. She brought it inside and felt it over carefully. The pelt was intact. The body was limp, but not stiff. It had been dead for less than an hour. She didn't tell my father about the rabbit. Years later, she told me that she kept it a secret because the rabbit wasn't just food. It was a gift. The way it was placed told her that. It wasn't tossed on the step. It was set down, centered on the top step, oriented with its head toward the door. The way you'd place a present on a table before the recipient arrived. Whatever had left it had thought about where to put it and how it would be found. And that degree of consideration was not the behavior of an animal leaving prey. It was the behavior of a person leaving an offering. Alma skinned the rabbit and stewed it, and she set the pelt on the porch railing overnight. In the morning, the pelt was gone. March came and sugar season with it. My father tapped the trees, ran the lines, and fired up the evaporator. It was the first season without Floyd, and it was hard. My father was doing the work of 2 men, and my mother was helping, and my grandmother was in the sugar house every day, stirring the pans by feel, grading the syrup by taste and smell because she couldn't see the color. The Thibodeau sugarbush produced 1,100 gallons that year, which was good, and my father sold it to a distributor in Montpelier for a price that was acceptable, and the farm survived another spring. During sugaring, the nighttime visits stopped. No footsteps, no wood, no gifts on the doorstep. Alma noticed the absence like you notice when a neighbor stops waving, a small wrongness in the pattern of daily life. She mentioned it to no one. In April, after the sap stopped running and the mud season turned the road to soup, the visits resumed. But they were different now. Instead of footsteps in the dooryard, my grandmother heard them closer. On the porch. A heavy presence was walking on the porch at night, moving slowly from one end to the other, pausing at the window, pausing at the door, then walking back. She could hear the boards flex under weight that was considerably more than human. The porch my grandfather built was designed to hold a cord of wood stacked against the rail for easy access. It didn't creak under a man's weight. It creaked under this. On a warm night in late April, my grandmother did a thing that my father would have killed her for if he'd known. She opened the door. She told me she stood in the doorway in her nightgown, with her bare feet on the threshold and the cold April air on her face, and she said out loud, in the voice she used when she was talking to Floyd's grave in the churchyard, "I know you're out there. I've known since January. You brought me wood and you brought me a rabbit, and you've been walking on this porch for 2 weeks, and I'm old and I'm blind and I'm tired of pretending I don't hear you. If you're going to hurt me, do it now. If you're not, you can sit on the porch and I'll bring you coffee." Nothing happened for a long time. She stood in the doorway and listened. The night was full of the usual sounds, peepers from the pond below the pasture, wind in the bare maple branches, an owl somewhere on the ridge. Then she heard breathing, close, not on the porch, in front of the porch, standing in the dooryard, maybe 10 feet from where she stood. The breathing was deep and slow and carried a warmth she said she could feel on her face, like standing near an open oven. The smell hit her then. It wasn't bad. It wasn't what she expected either. It smelled like the forest in October, like wet leaves and pine pitch and turned earth, and a deeper note underneath all of that, animal and warm and specific. The way every living thing has its own smell if you get close enough. She said it smelled alive. That was the word she used. It smelled alive as Floyd had smelled alive. Not like cologne or soap or anything manufactured, but like a body that had been working and breathing and existing in the world. My grandmother held out her hand. Palm up, fingers loose, the way you'd offer your hand to a dog you didn't know. She stood there with her hand out and the cold air on her skin and the breathing 10 feet away, and she waited. Alma told me she waited for maybe 5 minutes. Then she felt heat approach her hand. A large body moved closer, not touching her, not yet, but close enough that its warmth reached her fingertips. She felt the heat like standing near a wood stove from across the room. The breathing was right there now, above her head. You, which meant whatever it was, stood at least a foot taller than her. My grandmother didn't move. She kept her hand out, and then a touch landed on her palm. It wasn't quite a hand, but fingers, thick and warm and dry, that rested on her palm for maybe 3 seconds, and then withdrew. A touch so brief and so light that if she'd been sighted, she might have imagined it. But she was blind, and her sense of touch had been refined by years of making up for her lost vision, and she felt everything in those 3 seconds. The texture of the skin, rough and dense, like old leather that had been worked soft. The width of the fingers half again as wide as Floyd's had been, and Floyd had big hands. The temperature noticeably warmer than her own skin, and the care, the intention of the contact, the purpose behind it. This was not an accident. This was a greeting. She said goodnight. She went inside, closed the door, and stood in her kitchen with her hand raised in front of her face, like she could still feel the warmth on her palm, and she cried. She wasn't afraid. What she felt was closer to relief, though she couldn't name it until years later, when she finally had enough experience with it to call it by its proper name. What she felt that night, she told me, was the end of being alone. The visits became regular after that. Every few nights through the spring and summer of '78, my grandmother would hear the footsteps on the porch, and she'd open the door and the exchange would repeat. She'd hold out her hand. The touch would come. Sometimes just a brush of fingers. Sometimes a full grip. A hand wrapping around hers and holding on for long enough that she could map it with her fingers, trace the lines of the palm, feel the joints and the bones and the nails that were thick and blunt and smooth, more like a person's nails than an animal's, just worn down from use instead of being cut. She learned the shape of the hand as a blind person learns everything, through repetition and patience and a willingness to let information accumulate without forcing it into a category. She told me it was not a bear's paw. It was not a man's hand either. It was its own thing entirely, 5-fingered, opposable thumb, nimble enough to tear a log apart along its grain and gentle enough to hold a blind woman's hand without so much as pressing too hard on her knuckles. By August, she was sitting on the porch in the evenings and talking to it the way she used to talk to Floyd. She told it about her day, what she'd cooked, what birds she'd heard, how the garden was doing, which she assessed by feel, pulling weeds and checking tomatoes with her fingers. She told it about Floyd, about their wedding, about the war, about the 31 years they'd had together and how quickly 31 years can pass when you're busy and happy and not paying attention to the calendar. She talked and it listened, and she could tell it was listening because the breathing changed when she spoke, became shallower, more attentive, like a person leaning forward when they're interested in what you're saying. She gave it a name in September of '78, called it Luke, short for nothing, just a name she liked. Yeah, a good French-Canadian name that felt right in her mouth. I'm going to call you Luke because I can't keep calling you nothing, and if you don't like it, you'll have to tell me, and since you don't talk, I suppose Luke it is. When she said the name, it made a sound, a low, two-toned hum that rose slightly at the end. She took that as acceptance. Nobody knew. My father didn't know. My mother didn't know. Gerard and Colette had no idea. Alma kept the secret as she kept every secret, which was completely. She was a woman who had grown up in a household of 9 people in 4 rooms and had learned early that the only reliable privacy is the kind you carry inside you. She didn't tell a soul about Luke for almost 4 years. The first person in the family to find out was my father, and he didn't find out because she told him. He found out because of me. I was 4 years old in the summer of 1982, and I spent half my waking hours at my grandmother's farmhouse because my mother worked mornings at the Woodbury Village store and my grandmother was my babysitter. I loved being at Grandmama's house. She let me help in the kitchen, standing on a stool to stir whatever was on the stove. She told me stories in French that I only half understood but loved the sound of. She braided my hair with fingers that never made a mistake, despite not being able to see what they were doing. And she let me play in the yard unsupervised, which my mother never did, because my grandmother said a child who can't skin a knee once in a while will never learn to get up. On a morning in July of '82, I was playing in the dooryard, building a fort out of sticks near the stone wall that runs along the north pasture, and I saw something at the tree line. I was 4, and I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what I saw with any precision, but I remember it clearly because 4-year-olds are excellent witnesses to things they don't understand. They don't filter, they don't rationalize, they just observe. What I saw was a large, dark figure standing between 2 maple trees at the edge of the forest, about 100 yards from where I was playing. It was upright. It was very tall, taller than any person I had ever seen. It was dark brown, the color of the molasses my grandmother used in her baking, and it was covered in hair that I could see even from that distance, because the morning sun was hitting it from the side and turning the edges golden. It wasn't moving. It was watching me, and when I looked at it, it did something that I have thought about almost every day of my life for 42 years. It raised one hand, slowly, and held it in the air with the palm facing me. It wasn't a wave, and it wasn't a threat. A gesture I recognized even at 4 years old, because my grandmother did the same thing every time I came through her door. It was a greeting. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I walked inside and found my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table shelling peas by feel, running her thumb along each pod to find the seam, and I said, "Grandmama, there's a big brown man in the trees," and he said hello. Grandmama's hands stopped moving. She set the pea pod down and turned her face toward me, and even though she couldn't see me, the expression on her face was one I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear and it wasn't surprise. It was closer to the face a person makes when they hear a piece of music they haven't heard in years, and it catches them off guard. She asked me what the big brown man looked like. I told her he was taller than Daddy and browner than the molasses barrel, and that he had hair all over like the sheepskin on the rocking chair. She asked me what he did. I told her he waved. She asked me if I was scared. I said no. She nodded once, slowly, and said, "That's good. You don't need to be scared of him. His name is Luke." I went back outside, and he was gone. But that evening, after my father came to pick me up, my grandmother called him back to the house and told him to come inside alone. I know what she told him that night because my father told me years later when I was old enough to understand. And the way he described it was this: "Your grandmother sat me down at the kitchen table and told me she had a gentleman caller who was not a gentleman and not, strictly speaking, a caller. And she proceeded to describe something so far beyond anything I was prepared to hear that I spent the first 20 minutes trying to decide if she was having a stroke. She told him about the wood, the rabbit, the footsteps, the porch visits, the hand. Luke. 4 years of a relationship that my father hadn't known about, conducted entirely in darkness and in silence, between a blind widow and something that came down from Thibodeau Mountain on winter nights, and held her hand and listened to her talk about Floyd and the garden and the price of syrup. My father did not believe her. He told me this directly. He said, "Hazel, I thought your grandmother had lost her mind. I thought the blindness and the grief had finally caught up with her and she was hallucinating. I made an appointment with Dr. Doyle for the following week, and I spent 2 days trying to figure out how to get her evaluated without making her feel like I was committing her." He didn't need Dr. Doyle. 3 nights after my grandmother's confession, my father sat in the kitchen of the main farmhouse with the lights off and the window open, watching the tree line through a pair of binoculars he'd borrowed from Gerard. He told me he sat there from 9 at night until 1:30 in the morning, and he was about to give up when he saw movement at the edge of the forest. A shape separated from the shadows between the maples and walked into the moonlight. And my father said the binoculars nearly fell out of his hands. He described it to me when I was 16, and his hands were shaking when he did, not from fear but from the effort of containing something that had been sealed inside him for 12 years. He said it was at least 7.5 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, thick and dense like the coat of a winter horse, but longer. It walked upright with a stride that was smooth and controlled, not the shuffling gait of a bear on its hind legs, but the walk of something that had always walked on 2 legs and had been doing it for a very long time. Its arms were long, reaching past its knees, and its shoulders were so broad that it looked from 100 yards away like a door moving through the trees. It crossed the open ground between the forest and the farmhouse in maybe 20 seconds, each step covering 4 or 5 feet, and it stepped onto the porch with the ease of a man stepping onto his own porch, and it sat down in the rocking chair that Floyd had built in 1951, and it rocked. My father watched it rock for 15 minutes. Then the kitchen door opened and his mother walked out in her nightgown and her slippers, and she walked directly to the rocking chair and put her hand on its arm, and it took her hand, and they sat there together in the dark, on the porch of a farmhouse in central Vermont, while the moon moved across the sky, and the peepers sang in the pond, and my father crouched in the kitchen with binoculars and tears running down his face, because he understood, in that moment, that his mother was not insane. She was in love, and whatever she was in love with was real, and it was sitting in his dead father's rocking chair, holding his mother's hand with a tenderness that he said made him feel like an intruder in his own family's house. He never made the appointment with Dr. Doyle. What happened next was the Thibodeau family discovering, person by person, that the world was larger than we'd been told, and that the thing making it larger had been living on our mountain the whole time. My father told my mother the following week. June Thibodeau, born June Prue, raised Catholic in Hardwick, Vermont, daughter of a man who worked at the granite quarry and a woman who taught catechism at St. Norbert's, did not take the news well. She did not take it well for about 72 hours, during which she alternated between fury at my grandmother for keeping a secret that endangered her grandchildren, terror at the idea of something inhuman walking around the property at night, and a deep, quiet shame that she later described to me as the feeling of being told a truth that you should have figured out on your own. Because my mother, once the initial shock passed, realized that she had noticed things. The wood that appeared, the tracks she'd seen near the sugar house one March morning and dismissed as moose tracks, even though no moose track she'd ever seen was 17 inches long. The smell, that musky, organic, heavy smell that she'd caught on the breeze sometimes when the wind came down from the ridge, a smell she'd assumed was a bear or a dead deer or the compost pile. She'd explained all of it away. Everybody does. Everybody explains away the thing they can't explain. They pick the answer that lets them sleep at night. Until you can't. My mother became the second person to see Luke about a month after my father told her. She saw him from the kitchen window of her own house at dusk, crossing the clearing between the farmhouse and the sugar house. According to her, he moved with his head slightly forward and his arms swinging in long, controlled arcs, and his feet made almost no sound on the ground, despite his size. What struck her most was not the size or the hair, or the fact that he existed. The most startling thing was how comfortable he looked. He walked across that property like he belonged there, like he'd been walking across it for years, which, of course, he had. Gerard found out at Thanksgiving of '82, day when my father decided that keeping the secret from his own brother was untenable, and took him aside after dinner and told him. Gerard's reaction was to laugh, then to stop laughing, then to drive home to Montpellier in silence. He called my father 2 days later and said, "You're serious?" My father said, "Come up Saturday night, bring your binoculars." Gerard came. Gerard saw. Gerard did not laugh again. Colette was last. She and her husband, a man named Normand Beaulieu, came up for Christmas of '82, and my father and Gerard decided together that all three siblings needed to be on the same page. They told Colette after the children had gone to bed. Normand overheard from the hallway and came in asking what the hell they were talking about. Colette reacted with fear. Normand reacted with disbelief. 3 days later, Normand saw Luke crossing the north pasture at dawn and sat down on his own truck's tailgate and didn't speak for 45 minutes. By January of '83, every adult in the Thibodeau family knew about Luke. And the family did what families do when the world stops making sense. They held a meeting. The meeting took place on a Saturday evening in late January, around the kitchen table in the main farmhouse. My grandmother sat at the head, my father and mother on one side, Gerard on the other, Colette and Normand on folding chairs brought in from the pantry. The children, me included, were at my parents' house with a babysitter. I've reconstructed what happened from the accounts of 3 people who were there, my father, my mother, and my Aunt Colette, and all 3 told essentially the same story, which is either proof of their honesty or evidence that the meeting was so singularly bizarre that no amount of time could distort the memory. Alma opened by saying that she had not asked for a family meeting and she did not need her children's permission to live her life. She started in French, which she always did when she wanted the non-native speakers in the room, meaning Normand and my mother, to understand that the serious part had begun. Then she switched to English. She understood their concern. She was not going to pretend that having a visitor from the mountain was normal by any standard she or anyone else had grown up with. But the visitor had been coming for 5 years. He had never hurt her. He had never threatened her. He had kept her warm when she couldn't keep herself warm, and fed when the root cellar ran low, and company when the alternative was silence. She knew what he was, or rather she knew what he wasn't, which was human, and she knew what the world would think if the world ever found out. And she was asking her family to do the one thing Thibodeaux had always been good at, which was to mind their own business and let her be. Normand spoke first. He asked if she had considered the danger. What if it attacked her? What if it attacked the children? What if it decided the farm was its territory and became aggressive? Alma said Luke had been walking on this property for 5 years and had never harmed anything larger than a rabbit, and the rabbits were gifts, not kills. Nay, he'd carried 7 cords of wood to her shed in the winter of '77 alone, and you don't split 7 cords for someone you intend to hurt. My father asked how she could be sure it wouldn't change, how she could trust something she couldn't see. Alma said she trusted it the same way she trusted Floyd, by how it treated her over time. Trust earned in the dark, she told us, is the most reliable kind because there's nothing to distract you from the truth of what a person or a thing actually does versus what it looks like. Sighted people trust appearances, blind people trust behavior, and Luke's behavior over 5 years had been consistent, gentle, and devoted. The word devoted landed hard in that room. I've heard 3 versions of the silence that followed, and all 3 describe the same thing. Nay, a family of practical French-Canadian farmers sitting in a kitchen in Vermont, trying to process the idea that their blind, widowed mother had used the word devoted to describe her relationship with a thing that stood 7.5 feet tall and came down from the mountain in the dark. Gerard asked the question that nobody else wanted to ask. He asked if the relationship was romantic. Alma said yes. She didn't elaborate. She didn't defend it. She just said yes, and the kitchen got very quiet again. My mother told me years later that what struck her most about that meeting was not the strangeness of the situation, but the absence of shame in my grandmother's voice. Alma Thibodeau was not a woman who admitted weakness or asked for sympathy. She had survived a war and a hard farm and going blind and losing her husband, and she'd done all of it with a spine like a fence post. When she sat at that table and told her children that she loved something the world didn't believe existed, she said it with the same authority she used when she told you the syrup was ready to pull off the evaporator. She wasn't asking, she was informing. The family decided 3 things that night. First, nobody outside the family would be told. No neighbors, no church, no state, nobody. Second, the children, meaning me and Leon and our cousins, would be told when they were old enough to understand and keep the secret. Alma objected to the delay but accepted it. Third, no one would try to interfere with the visits. If Alma wanted Luke on her porch, Luke would be on her porch. Normand abstained from the third point. Everyone else agreed. And so began the longest, strangest, the most carefully guarded secret in the history of the Thibodeau family, and probably in the history of Woodbury, Vermont. A blind widow and a thing from the mountain conducting a love affair on the porch of a farmhouse at the end of a road the town had stopped maintaining, while 3 generations of relatives kept watch, kept quiet, and tried to fit Luke into a world that had no room for him. Over the next 24 years, I saw more of Luke than anyone except my grandmother, And what I saw was not a monster visiting a vulnerable woman. What I saw was a relationship, imperfect, strange, bounded by limitations that would have crushed anything less stubborn than my grandmother's heart, but a relationship. Two beings who could not speak each other's language and could not live in each other's world, choosing each other anyway, night after night, season after season, year after year. I was told the truth when I was 7 in the fall of '85. My father sat me down in the sugar house and explained that Grandmama had a friend who lived on the mountain, and that the friend was very big and very shy, and not like other people, and that I had probably already seen him because I was the one who told Grandmama, "I saw the big brown man in the trees when I was 4, and did I remember that?" And I said yes. And he said the big brown man was real, and his name was Luke, and we didn't tell anyone about him because people wouldn't understand and they might try to hurt him or take him away. And could I keep a secret? I said yes. I have kept it for 39 years, until now. Leon was told at 7 too. His reaction was to ask if Luke could come inside the house. And my grandmother, who was listening from the kitchen doorway, laughed so hard she had to sit down. Leon was always the practical one. Let me tell you what Luke looked like, because my grandmother couldn't, and my father's account was limited to what he saw through binoculars and kitchen windows. I saw Luke up close, not once, hundreds of times, over 2 decades, and I can tell you, with the authority of someone who has stood within arm's reach of one, what a living member of this species looks like. He was 7 feet and 5 or 6 inches tall. I know this because when I was 16, my father and I measured the door frame of the farmhouse, where Luke would sometimes stand, and the top of his head was about 3 inches below the lintel, which was 8 feet from the threshold. His build was heavy but not fat, broad through the chest and shoulders, tapering to a waist that was narrower than you'd expect for his overall size. His arms were long, the hands hanging to just above his knees, and his hands were enormous, each one big enough to cover my grandmother's entire face. His legs matched his body but were thicker than a human's, with a heaviness through the thighs that suggested muscle layered over muscle. I never saw him run, but the way he moved, with that controlled, fluid stride that covered ground faster than it looked like it should, told me he could move very fast if he needed to. His body was covered in hair. I make the distinction between what he had and what an animal wears because the texture was more like coarse human hair than animal pelt. It was dark brown, the color of wet bark, except on his chest and the insides of his arms, where it thinned out and was lighter, almost tawny. The hair on his head was longer, hanging past his shoulders, and by the time I was in my 20s, it had started to show gray at the temples and through the crown, a slow silvering that made him look, if you can accept the comparison, distinguished. The hair on his face was shorter and denser around the jaw and chin, giving him a bearded appearance, and his brow ridge, which was heavy and pronounced, had shorter hair that grew upward and slightly back, like an eyebrow that didn't know where to stop. The face is what stayed with me. It looked more like a person's face than anything else. His nose was broad and flat but not pushed in. His mouth was wide, with lips that were darker than the surrounding skin and more expressive than I would have expected. He could smile. I saw him smile many times, usually at my grandmother, a subtle change in the set of his mouth that softened his entire face. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, set deep beneath that brow ridge, and they were smart. I don't mean alert, which is what people usually mean when they call an animal intelligent. Luke's eyes tracked conversation. When you said something funny, his eyes changed. When you were upset, they changed a different way. You could see him thinking. You could see him caring. And you could see him understanding you, which was the most startling part, because he understood us without ever being one of us. He smelled like the mountain, wet earth and pine resin and old leaves and snow, with a musk underneath that was just him, heavy and warm and not unpleasant once you were used to it. Alma said she could always tell when he was nearby because the air changed. It got warmer and heavier like the air before a thunderstorm, and it carried his scent the way a river carries pollen. He communicated. He didn't use words, and I couldn't transcribe or reproduce what he did for another person. He used sounds that varied in pitch and length and carried emotional content the way music carries emotional content, not through literal meaning but through pattern and tone. A low, steady hum meant contentment. A short, rising note meant attention or interest. A series of rapid, clipped sounds meant concern or warning. A long, falling tone that he made with his mouth slightly open and his eyes half closed meant something I can only call tenderness, and he made that sound most often when my grandmother was talking to him, which she did constantly, narrating her day, telling him stories, describing things she could no longer see, as though she were painting pictures for someone who had never been inside a house. The relationship between Luke and my grandmother was built on presence. That's the best word I have for it. He was present with her more completely than I have seen between two human beings. When she spoke, he listened with his whole body, turning toward her, leaning slightly forward, his breathing slowing like the act of listening took everything he had. When she was upset, he knew before anyone else did, and he would place his hand on her arm or her shoulder or the top of her head with a gravity that said, without language, I am here. When she laughed, and she laughed often because Alma found the absurdity of her own situation genuinely funny, he would make the closest thing to a laugh that his throat could produce, a breathy, rhythmic exhalation that sounded like someone pumping a bellows. Alma called it his chuckle and said it was the most honest laugh she'd ever heard because he didn't know how to fake one. They sat together on the porch on every night that wasn't too cold or too wet, which in Vermont means about 6 months of the year. He sat in Floyd's rocking chair, which had been reinforced by my father with steel brackets after Luke cracked the original joints. She sat in the straight-backed chair beside it. Sometimes they held hands. Sometimes she leaned against his arm, which was big enough that she could rest her head on it like a pillow. Sometimes he reached over and touched her hair, running his fingers through it with a gentleness you wouldn't believe from hands that size, and she would close her eyes, which is what blind people do when they're experiencing pleasure, a reflex that serves no visual purpose but persists anyway. And she would make a small sound of contentment that matched his hum so closely that if you were standing in the kitchen and listening through the window, you'd think there was only one voice. Every visit had its rituals. Every visit began the same way. He would approach the porch from the north, always from the north, and stop at the bottom of the steps. She would open the door and stand in the doorway. He would make the two-toned hum, low then high, that was his greeting. She would say, "Bonsoir, Luke." He would climb the steps and sit in the chair. She would bring him something. In the early years, it was coffee, which he drank without sugar and seemed to enjoy, or at least tolerated. Later, it was cider from the apples on the farm, which he loved and would drink until the jug was empty. In the winter, it was warm milk with molasses, which she heated on the wood stove and carried out in a pot because no mug in the house was big enough for his hands. He brought her things too, not every visit but often. Stones from the creek, smooth and flat and warm from being held in his palm. Clusters of balsam needles which she would hold to her nose and breathe in. Honeycomb, dripping and fresh, that she ate with her fingers while he watched. Once a feather so large and so soft that she spent an hour turning it in her hands and couldn't identify the bird. She kept it in a jar on her dresser. I still have it. I've had 3 ornithologists look at it, and none of them could match it to any known species. He never came inside the house, not once. Alma said she invited him many times and he always declined, not by shaking his head or making a negative sound, but by simply not moving. He would sit on the porch and look at the open doorway and not enter. She thought it was a boundary, a line between his world and hers that he recognized even if she didn't. Or maybe the house was too small. Or maybe indoor spaces made him uneasy for reasons she couldn't understand. Whatever the reason, the porch was their place, the threshold between the domestic and the wild, the lit and the dark, the human and the other, and they made it enough. The night I understood what my grandmother had with Luke, I was 14. It was a summer night in '92, clear and warm, and I had come to the farmhouse to help my grandmother with canning. We'd been putting up green beans all afternoon, and I was tired and wanted to go home, but my grandmother asked me to stay and sit with her on the porch because the fireflies were out and she loved to hear me describe them. We were sitting on the porch and I was telling her about the fireflies, how they rose from the tall grass in the meadow like sparks from a fire that was burning underground, when I heard Luke coming through the trees. The footsteps were easy to pick out by then, heavy and spaced and silent between impacts, like a heartbeat made of weight. My grandmother heard them too, and I watched her face change. Not a dramatic change, a softening. The muscles around her sightless eyes relaxed. Her mouth found a shape that was not quite a smile, but was closer to a smile than anything else I'd seen on her face all day. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, opened slightly, fingers uncurling like she was getting ready to hold on to him. He came up the steps and sat down, and when he took her hand, she turned her face toward him with an expression that I recognized because I had seen it on my mother's face when my father came home from a long day in the sugarbush, and I had seen it on the faces of women at church when their husbands walked through the door after being away, and I had seen it in every movie I'd ever watched, where two people who loved each other were reunited after an absence. It was the face of someone whose missing piece has arrived. She said, "Hazel was telling me about the fireflies." He made the two-toned hum, low then high, his greeting, which was also his acknowledgement of me. I said, "Hi, Luke." He looked at me. His eyes caught the light from the kitchen window, and for a second they reflected amber like a deer's eyes in headlights, but warmer, more focused. Then he looked back at my grandmother and settled into the chair and rocked. And she rocked beside him, and I sat on the porch steps and described the fireflies while two beings who had no business being together rocked in the darkness and held hands and listened to a 14-year-old girl talk about light. That was the night I stopped thinking of Luke as a secret to be kept and started thinking of him as family. The years passed. Luke came and went with the seasons. He was most present in the cold months, November through March, when he appeared almost every night. In the summer, his visits were less frequent, sometimes only once or twice a week. Alma said he had responsibilities on the mountain, others of his kind, obligations she couldn't see and didn't ask about, because she understood that his life extended far beyond the porch of her farmhouse, and it wasn't her place to map it. There were difficult times. In the winter of '94, a logging company bought a parcel of land on the east side of Thibodeau Mountain and began cutting. The sound of chainsaws and skidders carried across the ridge for 3 months, and during those 3 months, Luke didn't come. Not once. My grandmother sat on the porch every night and waited, and every night she came inside alone and said nothing. And the silence in her was worse than any sound of grief I have ever heard. When the cutting stopped in April and the crews left, Luke returned within a week. My grandmother opened the door and he was standing at the bottom of the steps, and she walked down those steps in her nightgown and her slippers and wrapped her arms around as much of him as she could reach, which was his waist. and she held on, and he stood there and let her hold on, and after a while he put his hand on the back of her head and made the long falling tone that meant tenderness, and she cried into his chest, and I watched from the kitchen window with tears on my own face, because I was 16 and I understood, probably for the first time, that love is not diminished by strangeness. It is tested by it, and what survives the test is real. In 2000, my grandmother turned 78. She was smaller than she'd been, as old people get, compressed by time and gravity. Her hands shook with a tremor she couldn't control. Her hearing, which had been sharp enough to compensate for her blindness, was starting to fade. She needed help with things she'd done independently for decades: bathing, dressing, navigating the stairs to the root cellar. My father and Gerard took turns staying with her during the day. My mother cooked her meals and brought them over. I came every weekend and did her laundry and cleaned the house and sat with her on the porch in the evenings. Luke seemed to know she was declining. His visits became longer. Instead of arriving at 9 and leaving at midnight, he would come at dusk and stay until dawn, sitting in the rocking chair through the coldest hours. And sometimes my father would find him still there at 5 in the morning when he came to light the stove. Once, my father told me, he came over at 4:30 on a February morning when it was 31 below zero, and found Luke sitting in the chair with my grandmother asleep in his lap, wrapped in a blanket, her head against his chest, his hand resting on her back. My father stood in the doorway and looked at them and went back to his house, without waking either of them. He told me later that he felt like he'd walked in on something sacred and had no right to interrupt it. My grandmother died on March 7, 2006. She was 84 years old. She died in her bed in the farmhouse, in the room where she'd been born, with my father holding one hand and my mother holding the other, and Leon and I standing at the foot of the bed. It was a Thursday. The sugaring season had just started, and the evaporator was running in the sugar house, and the sweet steam was drifting across the property the way it always did in March. And my grandmother took her last breath, surrounded by the smell of maple, and the sound of sap boiling, and the presence of the people she loved most in the world. Luke was not in the room, but he was there. I know because I saw him. When my grandmother's breathing changed, when it became shallow and irregular, and we all knew it was close, I looked out the window. It was early evening, just past 6, and the light was fading fast. The snow in the dooryard was deep, maybe 2 feet, undisturbed except for the paths we'd shoveled to the sugar house and the woodshed. And standing at the tree line, in the gap between the 2 largest maples, was Luke. He was motionless. His arms were at his sides. He was looking at the house with an intensity that I could feel through the glass, and even from 200 yards away, even in the failing light, I could see that his posture was different. He was leaning forward slightly. His shoulders were higher than usual. His head was tilted at an angle that, in a human being, I would have described as anguished. My grandmother died at 6:43. My father looked at his watch when her breathing stopped, and he noted the time, because that is what people do when they can't do anything else. At 6:43 from the tree line, a sound rose into the cold air that I will carry with me until the day I die. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard from Luke. It wasn't the hum, and it wasn't the greeting, and it wasn't the tenderness tone. A sound raw and deep and broken. A sound that came from the bottom of a chest cavity large enough to hold a grown woman. A sound that lasted maybe 8 seconds and then stopped, and then came again, and then a third time, and each time it was slightly different, slightly more ragged, as though whatever was making the sound was being torn apart by the force of what it was trying to say. My father heard it, my mother heard it, Leon heard it. We stood in that bedroom and listened to something on the mountain grieve, and nobody said a word, because there was nothing to say. We had all known Luke. We had all watched my grandmother love him, and we all understood. standing in that room with her body still warm, that the sound from the tree line was the sound of a heart breaking in a chest that was not human but was, in every way that mattered, a heart. He stayed at the tree line all night. I know because I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and watched the window, and every time I looked, the dark shape was there, standing in the same gap between the maples, motionless, facing the house. At some point during the night, it snowed, and in the morning the snow around the tree line was unmarked, except for the 2 deep impressions where he had stood, pressed 4 inches into the frozen ground by weight and grief and the refusal to leave. On the second night, he came closer. So he crossed the dooryard and climbed the porch steps and sat in the rocking chair. He sat there until dawn. When I opened the door at 6 in the morning to bring in firewood, he was gone, but the chair was still rocking, and the air on the porch smelled like wet bark and pine resin and sorrow. He came to the porch every night for 2 weeks after my grandmother died. He sat in the chair and rocked and made no sound. Then the visits stopped. I did not see Luke again for 3 years. The family buried my grandmother in the Woodbury Village Cemetery beside Floyd. The service was small. Family, a few neighbors, the minister from the United Church. Nobody mentioned Luke. Nobody mentioned anything unusual about Alma Thibodeau's life, except that she had been blind for 30 years and had lived alone on a hill farm and had been remarkably self-sufficient for a woman in her condition. The word alone sat in my throat like a stone through the entire service, because she had not been alone. She had not been alone for 28 years. The world didn't know that, but we did. And the gap between what the world knew and what we knew felt like standing on one side of a canyon and watching everyone else walk along the other side, oblivious to the depth of the space between us. Life continued. My father ran the sugarbush. I took over more and more of the operation as his health declined, until by 2010 I was doing most of the tapping and boiling myself. Leon had moved to Burlington and worked in construction. He came up for sugaring season every year, 2 weeks of backbreaking labor that he approached with the same cheerful stubbornness that characterized everything he did. My father died in 2012, another heart attack. Another Thibodeau man taken by his own circulatory system in the middle of an ordinary day. My mother moved to Morrisville to be near Colette, and I was left alone on the farm, the last Thibodeau on the Thibodeau land, running 4,000 taps and boiling sap in a sugar house that smelled like 120 years of springtimes. I saw Luke again on a night in October of 2009. I was on the porch of the main farmhouse, which I had moved into after my father died, sitting in my grandmother's chair, drinking cider and watching the stars. The night was cold and clear, and the Milky Way was a white river across the sky, and I was thinking about nothing in particular when I heard the footsteps, heavy, spaced, coming from the tree line to the north. I didn't move. I didn't reach for a flashlight. I sat in the chair and listened, and the footsteps crossed the dooryard and stopped at the base of the porch steps, and I heard the breathing, deep and slow and warm, and the smell came with it, the bark and resin and earth smell that I hadn't realized I'd missed until it was there again, filling the cold air like a hand on my shoulder. I said, "Hello, Luke." The two-toned hum, low, then high. After 3 years, the greeting was the same. He climbed the steps and sat in the rocking chair. I heard the brackets creak under his weight and then settle. He rocked. I sat. The stars turned overhead, and the cider went warm in my hands, and neither of us made a sound for a long time. Then I said, "She missed you at the end. She asked for you." This was true. In her last days, my grandmother had called for Luke several times, not by name. She'd say in French, "Is he here? Tell him to come in. It's cold out there." She was confused by then, mixing decades, talking to Floyd and Luke and her mother, and people who had been dead for years. But the requests for Luke were specific and repeated, and tinged with a worry that suggested she was more concerned about him being cold on the porch than she was about her own dying. Luke made a sound I'd never heard before, lower than the hum, shorter with a quality I can only describe as bruised. It lasted 2 seconds, then silence, then the rocking resumed. He visited me 6 more times that fall, and 4 times that winter, and sporadically through the following spring. The visits were shorter than they'd been with my grandmother, an hour, sometimes 2. He'd sit in the chair and rock, and I'd talk, the way Alma had talked, about the farm and the weather and the sugaring and the things I could see that he probably already knew. The hawk nest on the South Ridge, the beaver dam that was flooding the lower trail, the way the mountain looked in October when the maples turned and the whole ridge went orange and gold. He listened the way he'd always listened, with his whole body, and sometimes he made the hum, and sometimes he didn't, and I tried not to read too much into the silences because I had learned from my grandmother that silence between 2 beings who trust each other is not emptiness. So it is a different kind of conversation. The visits continued, on and off, for 15 years. They still continue. He was here last week. He's older now. The silver in his hair has spread from his temples through his entire crown and down his back, and he moves more slowly, with a carefulness that might be age, or might be caution, or might just be the way a being moves when it has been alive long enough to stop hurrying. But his eyes are the same, dark and deep and smart and kind, and full of a feeling I don't have a word for. My grandmother called it love. I think it might be bigger than love. I think it might be the thing love comes from. I run the sugarbush alone now. 4,000 taps, 1,000 gallons in a good year. I tap in March and boil through April, and sell the syrup to the same distributor in Montpelier that my grandfather sold to, and when I'm in the sugar house at 2 in the morning feeding the evaporator and the steam is rolling out through the cupola and the air tastes like caramel, I sometimes hear footsteps on the roof. Heavy, careful footsteps, moving from one end to the other, pausing at the cupola where the sweet steam rises into the dark sky. He likes the smell. Alma told me he always liked the smell of the sugar. She said he'd stand at the tree line during boiling season and inhale, and his whole body would relax, the way a person relaxes when they smell something that reminds them of home. My grandmother asked me to tell this story. She asked me in 2004, 2 years before she died, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd shelled 10,000 pounds of peas and drunk 15,000 cups of coffee and told a thing from the mountain about her garden and her dead husband and the price of syrup. She said, "Hazel, someday you're going to have to tell people about Luke, not yet, but someday, when the world is ready to hear that love doesn't look the way they think it does." I don't know if the world is ready, I doubt it, but my grandmother was usually right about things, and she was right about this much. The story needs to be told, not because it proves anything about what lives in the Green Mountains of Vermont, though it does, not because it contributes to any scientific database or government record, though it could, but because a blind woman fell in love with something the world refuses to believe exists, and she was not crazy, and she was not desperate, and she was not a victim of her own loneliness. She was a woman who lost her sight and found something that most sighted people never see. There is something on Thibodeau Mountain. It has been there for as long as anyone in my family can remember, and probably for longer than that. It is tall and covered in dark hair that is going silver with age. It carries firewood and catches rabbits and sits in a rocking chair on a porch in central Vermont and drinks cider and listens to a woman talk about her day. It grieves when the people it loves die. It comes back even after years of absence. It greets you with a sound that rises at the end, like a question, like it's asking whether you're still willing to sit with it in the dark and accept what it is without needing to understand it. My grandmother's name was Alma Thibodeau. She was born in 1922 and died in 2006. She loved two men in her life, one human and one not, and she loved them both with a ferocity that did not diminish with blindness or age, or the burden of carrying a secret that no one in her world would have believed. She kept the secret for 28 years, then she gave it to her family, and now her family is giving it to you. We are not offering it as proof, and we are not making a claim. We are offering it as a testimony to something my grandmother understood better than anyone I have ever known, that the heart does not require eyes to see what matters, that love is not limited by species or by form or by the expectations of a world that thinks it has cataloged every kind of tenderness that exists, and that sometimes the most human thing in the room is the one that isn't human at all. I have work to do. The sap is running. The evaporator needs wood. And tonight, if I'm lucky, I'll hear footsteps on the sugar house roof, and I'll know that Luke is there, standing in the steam, breathing in the sweetness, keeping watch over the farm the way he has kept watch for almost 50 years. And I'll go out on the porch and say, "Bonsoir, Luke," the way my grandmother taught me, and he'll make the sound, the two-toned hum, low, then high, and that will be enough. It has always been enough. My grandmother knew that, and now maybe so do you.